The final slam of the oak door echoed the closing of a tomb. Thomas Graves, his face a mask of grim piety, pressed 3 silver dollars into Ilara's palm. They were cold and insultingly heavy. "The law is the law, Ilara," he said, his voice devoid of the warmth he'd shown when his brother Silas was alive. "The farm reverts to the bloodline. It was never truly yours." Outside, on the porch of the home she had built with her husband, the small community of Promise Creek watched. They were silent, their gazes a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. They saw a woman undone, a widow of 24, now rendered homeless and destitute by the very man who should have protected her. She stood there, a solitary figure in a worn wool dress, as the life she knew was legally dismantled. The lawyer, a man with ink-stained fingers and averted eyes, had read the document in a monotone drone. Silas had never formally added her name to the deed. An oversight, a piece of paperwork left for a tomorrow that never came for him. Now, that oversight was a weapon in his brother's hand. The farm, the livestock, the 2 sturdy mules, the furniture polished with her own hands, all of it belonged to Thomas. Her entire world had been reduced to what she could carry. She had the clothes on her back, the 3 silver dollars that felt like stones of shame, and a single, curious inheritance Silas had left her in his personal effects. It was a deed, folded and creased, for a plot of land everyone in the valley knew was worthless. A vertical slice of rock and scree on the north face of the ridge, known for a generation as Graves' Folly. An ancestor had bought it, convinced there was gold in the rock, and had died a pauper for his belief. The land was a family joke, a cautionary tale, and now it was hers. Mr. Gable, the owner of the town mercantile, and a man whose opinions were as solid as his sacks of flour, approached her. He cleared his throat, a sound of practiced sympathy. "Ilara, my dear," he began, his voice low. "Be sensible. That deed is worth nothing. I'll give you $1 for it, for the paper it's printed on. Use that money, and the pittance Thomas gave you, and buy a stagecoach ticket east. There are factories. A woman can find work." He was offering what he thought was kindness, a path to a life of anonymous labor, a surrender. Others nodded in agreement. This was the sensible way. Leave the failure behind. Disappear. But as Ilara looked at their faces, at the pity that felt more suffocating than contempt, a cold, hard thing settled in her heart. It was not hope. It was something more primal, more stubborn. It was refusal. She would not be erased. She would not run. She met Mr. Gable's gaze, her own eyes clear and dry. She folded her fingers over the 3 silver coins. "I will keep the land," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried in the still air. A murmur went through the small crowd. It was not the response they expected. This was not the broken widow. This was someone else. She turned her back on the home that was no longer hers, on the faces of the people who had already written her story's end. She walked directly to Mr. Gable's mercantile, the bell above the door chiming her entrance. The store owner followed, a look of consternation on his face. Inside, she laid 2 of her $3 on the polished wood counter. "I need salt," she said, her voice steady, "and flour, a sharpening stone for an axe, and a small sack of your hardiest winter vegetable seeds, cabbage, turnip, whatever will grow in the cold." Mr. Gable stared at her as if she'd lost her mind. "Daughter," he said, shaking his head slowly, "there is no soil on Graves' Folly, only rock and wind. You are buying ghosts." "Nevertheless," she replied, pushing the coins forward, "this is what I need." He packed her order in silence, the weight of the town's judgment filling the space between them. She took her small parcel of supplies, and with her last $1, she bought the one thing she had seen in the corner that she knew she could not make for herself: a heavy wool blanket. She left the store without another word. She did not look back at the town of Promise Creek. She faced north, toward the unforgiving ridge, and began to walk. The only other thing she carried was Silas's axe, its head wrapped in cloth, its hickory handle smooth and familiar in her hand. It was all that was left of him, a tool for building in a world that had just been torn down. The journey was a punishment. The gentle slopes of the valley floor gave way to a harsh, rising terrain of stone and stunted pine. The path was a faint track used only by hunters, and it soon disappeared altogether. Ilara pushed through dense, scratchy undergrowth, the weight of her supplies and the heavy axe head a dragging anchor. The air grew colder as she climbed, the wind a constant, whining thief that stole warmth from her bones. The sun was a pale disk in a gray sky, offering light but no comfort. She was utterly alone, the town a distant memory, the wilderness an indifferent force all around her. After hours of climbing, her muscles screaming in protest, she finally reached the landmark she had been told to find: a trio of skeletal, lightning-blasted pines. Beyond them lay her inheritance. She rounded the trees and stopped, the breath catching in her throat. Graves Folly was not a piece of land. It was a wound in the earth. A sheer cliff face of dark, weeping granite rose hundreds of feet into the air, a massive wall against the sky. At its base was a sloping field of scree, a chaotic jumble of sharp-edged rocks and gravel that had broken from the cliff over centuries. A shallow overhang, no deeper than a farmer's cart, offered the only break in the vertical stone. The wind, channeled by the ridge, howled across the rock field, a relentless, soul-chilling scream. This was it, her sanctuary, her home. It was a place of utter desolation. Mr. Gable was right. The town was right. Thomas was right. This was a place to die. Despair, cold and absolute, washed over her. It was a physical force, buckling her knees. She sank onto a large, flat stone, the sack of supplies slipping from her numb fingers. The wind tore at her hair and bit at her exposed skin. Tears she had refused to shed in town now froze on her cheeks. She had made a fool's choice, trading the slow death of a factory for the quick, cold death of the mountain. For a long, hollow moment, she simply sat, a tiny, defeated figure in a landscape of brutal indifference. She was beaten. Shivering, driven by the last vestiges of instinct, she crawled toward the shallow overhang, seeking even a sliver of shelter from the punishing wind. She pressed herself against the back wall of the alcove, pulling the wool blanket around her shoulders. And then she felt it. The wind did not follow her. Under the overhang, the air was unnaturally still. The roar of the gale was a muffled sound, a beast prowling just outside her small pocket of calm. The massive cliff face was a perfect shield, turning the full force of the north wind aside. She pressed her raw, cold hands against the granite wall behind her. A second shock went through her, one that had nothing to do with the cold. The rock was not cold. It was warm. Not hot, but a deep, persistent warmth radiated from it, as if it held the memory of a summer sun. She ran her hands over its surface, feeling the steady, low-grade heat. A geothermal fissure, perhaps, a deep vein of the Earth's own warmth bleeding to the surface. It was a miracle. Then she heard it. Over the distant howl of the wind, a quiet, rhythmic sound. Drip, drip, drip. Her eyes followed the sound to a dark crevice near the floor. A tiny, clear bead of water emerged from the rock, hung for a moment, and fell to a small, damp patch of moss below. It was a seep, a slow but constant source of clean water, filtering through the mountain's heart. In the span of a minute, everything had changed. The town saw a worthless cliff face, a place of wind and rock. They were wrong. They saw a tomb, but it held a secret. It offered shelter from the wind, a source of steady warmth, and a spring of fresh water. It was not a place to die. It was a place to begin. The despair did not vanish, but it receded, replaced by the same cold, hard resolve that had made her walk away from Promise Creek. She had the rock, the water, the warmth, and the axe. It would have to be enough. The work began at dawn the next day, and it was a brutal education. Her first task was to clear the floor of the alcove. The scree was a treacherous mess of sharp-edged stones, some as small as her fist, others as large as a travel trunk. She had no shovel, only her hands. She worked for hours, her fingers quickly scraped raw, her palms blistering. She moved each rock, one by one, using the larger ones to build a low retaining wall at the edge of the overhang, creating a level platform. The labor was agonizing. Her back screamed, her muscles burned with a fire she had never known. By day's end, she had cleared a space barely large enough to lie down in, and her hands were a mess of broken blisters and blood. Her next task was wood. Below the cliff face, a sparse forest of pine and aspen clung to the mountainside. She took up Silas's axe, its weight unfamiliar. Her first swings were clumsy, glancing off the tough bark of a dead-standing pine. The axe head vibrated, sending a painful shock up her arms. She gritted her teeth and tried again, remembering how Silas had stood, how he had let the tool's own weight do the work. Slowly, a rhythm emerged. The sharp thwack of steel on wood became the only sound besides the wind. Finally, with a great groan, her first tree fell. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. Getting the log back up the slope to her alcove was another battle. She pushed, pulled, and rolled it over the rocky ground, her body straining with every inch of progress. It took her the better part of a day to move 3 small logs. Days bled into weeks, each one a cycle of grueling, repetitive labor. She felled more trees, her hands callousing over, her arms and back hardening into new, unfamiliar shapes. She learned to notch the logs with the axe, fitting them together to form the front wall of her shelter, a solid barrier of wood that connected one side of the stone alcove to the other. The cliff face was her back wall, the overhang her roof. She needed only to close the front. Near the water seep, she discovered a deposit of dense, gray clay. She dug it out with her hands, mixed it with water and dried grasses from the lower slopes, and created a thick, sticky daub. She used this to chink the gaps between the logs, sealing her home against the wind. The work was slow, painstaking. A failed log joint meant hours of wasted effort. A poorly mixed batch of daub would crumble and fall away. But with each small success, a perfectly fitted corner, a smoothly sealed seam, the structure grew. She built her survival systems with the same grim determination. She carved a space in the rock wall for a hearth, using a narrow, natural fissure above it as a flue. The first time she lit a fire, the smoke drew perfectly up the fissure and disappeared, invisible against the dark stone of the cliff. The great granite wall began to drink in the heat. Hours after the fire burned down to embers, the rock itself radiated a gentle, pervasive warmth, turning her entire shelter into a giant, heated stone. This was her furnace. She carefully excavated the water seep, deepening the small pool and lining it with a thick layer of clay, which she smoothed and allowed to harden. It created a small, clean cistern that held several gallons, refilling itself with a slow, steady drip that was the most reassuring sound in her world. This was her well. Outside the log wall, but still under the protection of the overhang, she built low, stone-walled beds for a garden. The most back-breaking work of all was hauling soil. Bucket by bucket, sack by sack, she carried rich, dark earth up from the valley floor, her legs and back protesting every single step. Into this precious soil she planted her seeds, turnips, cabbages, hardy greens. The geothermal warmth from the cliff face kept the ground from freezing, creating a small, miraculous microclimate. This was her farm. After nearly 2 months of relentless labor, she knew she needed more. She needed protein. She needed life. She took the last of her saved food, the axe and the wool blanket, and walked back to Promise Creek. Her arrival caused a stir. The woman who walked into Mr. Gable's mercantile was not the same one who had left. She was gaunt, her face browned by the wind, her clothes tattered. But her eyes held a new light, a fierce, unwavering confidence. Her hands were no longer a lady's hands. They were the calloused, scarred hands of a builder. Whispers followed her through the store. She ignored them. She walked to the counter where a small velvet box sat, displaying trinkets for sale. She took the simple gold band from her finger, her wedding ring, and placed it on the counter. "What will you give me for it?" she asked Mr. Gable. He looked at the ring, then at her, and his expression softened for the first time. He named a price that was more than fair. Ilara nodded. "I am not buying a ticket east, Mr. Gable," she said. "I need 6 of your best laying hens, a rooster, and that small piglet from the pen out back, and as much grain as the rest will buy me." The store fell silent. The sheer audacity of her request was stunning. Livestock? On Graves' Folly? The absurdity of it was too much. A man in the corner snickered. "Going to keep them in a cave? What are you going to call it? The Cliffside Coop?" The name hung in the air, dripping with mockery. Mr. Gable sighed, shaking his head, but he took the ring. He helped her load the squawking chickens into crates and get a rope on the squealing piglet. Leading her noisy, clumsy new herd out of town, Ilara felt every eye on her back. They saw a madwoman, throwing good money after bad, marching a parade of doomed animals to a barren rock. They didn't see the warm stone, the constant water, or the sealed walls. They saw only the folly. The journey back was a chaotic ordeal. The chickens squawked, the piglet fought the rope at every step. As she struggled up the final slope, exhausted and frustrated, she realized she was being followed. A dog, a scrawny mix of breeds with ribs showing and one ear torn, watched her from a distance. He was an outcast, just like her. When she finally reached her shelter and collapsed in exhaustion, he sat 20 yards away, watching with intelligent, weary eyes. She broke off a piece of the coarse bread she had bought and tossed it to him. He snatched it from the air and devoured it. He did not leave. That night, as the temperature dropped, he crept closer to the warmth of her fire. She woke in the middle of the night to find him sleeping near the door, a silent guardian. She named him Silas. He was her only companion, a steady, warm presence in the vast, crushing silence of the mountain. He was the first living thing to share her home. The town's joke took root. The name Cliffside Coop spread through the valley, a convenient shorthand for Ilara's perceived madness. Her brother-in-law, Thomas, was the most vocal purveyor of the tale. He would hold court at the mercantile, describing with great theatricality his poor, grief-stricken sister-in-law, living in a hole in the rock, talking to chickens. Some called her the cave girl, others the widow of the folly. The stories painted her as a pitiable, tragic figure, a woman who had broken under the strain of her loss and retreated into a fantasy world on a barren cliff. One afternoon, a hunter named Brant, a man known for his rugged self-assurance, made the climb to see the spectacle for himself. He He found Ilara splitting firewood, the dog Silas watching him with a low growl. He looked at her sturdy log wall, the wisp of smoke curling from the hidden fissure chimney and the neatly chinked seams. He couldn't see inside, but what he saw was not the ramshackle lean-to he expected. It was solid. It was deliberate. Still, he could not shake his prejudice. "It's a fine-looking tomb you've built, Mistress Graves," he said, a smirk playing on his lips. "But a wooden wall won't stop the winter. That wind will cut right through it. Your chickens will be statues by first frost." Ilara simply paused, leaned on her axe, and looked at him. "The rock stops the wind," she said, and then went back to her work, offering no further explanation. Her quiet confidence unnerved him more than any argument would have. He left, shaking his head, convinced she was deluded. As autumn deepened, winter descended on the ridge, not as a guest, but as an occupying army. The wind became a constant physical presence, a shrieking banshee that clawed at the world. But inside her shelter, a quiet, orderly routine became Ilara's anchor. Her world shrank to the circle of warmth cast by her fire. Each day was a testament to the systems she had built. She would wake in the deep, silent warmth, the great stone wall behind her radiating the stored heat of the night's fire. Her first task was always the fire, adding logs from the neat stack that filled one entire wall of her home, a fortress of fuel. Her animals were housed in a smaller, walled-off section of the alcove, sharing the warmth of the geothermal rock. The chickens, snug in their straw-lined boxes, were a miracle. Shielded from the wind and cold that would have frozen them solid in a conventional barn, they continued to lay. Each morning, she would find 5 or 6 smooth, brown eggs. They were more precious than gold, a rich source of protein and fat in the lean months. The piglet grew fat on scraps and foraged roots. Her small garden, defying the season, produced a slow but steady supply of tough, leafy greens and small, sweet turnips. The air inside smelled of wood smoke, damp earth, and living things. Outside, the world was dying. Inside, her small ecosystem thrived. The solitude was absolute. Days would pass without a sound but the wind, the crackle of the fire, and the gentle noises of her animals. She was utterly alone, yet she was not lonely. She was the sovereign of her small, warm kingdom, her life measured in the rituals of survival. Fetching water from the cistern, tending the plants, feeding the animals, mending her clothes by the firelight. The dog Silas, a warm weight against her feet. One night, a true test came. A deep, guttural howling echoed from the valley below, closer than she had ever heard it before. A wolf pack, driven by hunger, had scented her livestock. Silas was instantly on his feet, a frantic, low growl rumbling in his chest, the hair on his back rigid. Ilara's heart pounded. She checked the heavy wooden bar on her door, ensuring it was secure. She peered through a small chink in the wall. In the faint moonlight, she saw them. Gray, ghostly shapes moving through the rocks below. They circled her shelter for hours, their howls tearing at the night. But her walls were solid logs, her door was strong, and the sheer cliff face offered them no other point of attack. She and her small flock were safe inside their fortress of wood and stone. The wolves eventually moved on, their hunt a failure. The test had been passed. Her shelter was not just a home, it was a defense. The snows began in early December, gentle at first, a soft blanket that muted the hard edges of the landscape. But in the first week of January, in the year of 1883, the sky turned a bruised, leaden gray, and the real storm arrived. It did not come gently. It descended like a hammer blow, a blizzard of unprecedented fury. The wind was no longer a sound. It was a solid wall of force that screamed down from the north, carrying a blinding, horizontal torrent of ice and snow. The world outside Ilara's shelter simply ceased to exist, erased by a swirling vortex of white. Down in Promise Creek, the community's confidence was the first casualty. Their sturdy, conventional homes, built to withstand ordinary winters, began to fail. The sheer weight of the snow, accumulating at an impossible rate, caused the roof of the meeting hall to groan and then collapse with a deafening crack. Jonas Miller's barn, a structure that had stood for 50 years, was crushed, his livestock buried within. The wind, a malevolent entity, found every crack and flaw. It shattered the large glass windows of Mr. Gable's Mercantile, turning his store into a frozen cavern of ruined goods. Chimneys, battered by the gale and clogged with ice, failed to draw, filling homes with choking, blinding smoke. Families were forced to extinguish their precious fires, and the killing cold began to creep inside. Firewood, neatly stacked in woodsheds and against the sides of houses, became unreachable, buried under 10-foot drifts that formed in minutes. The town's preparations, their collective wisdom, proved useless against the storm's sheer, brute force. Promise Creek was being dismantled, house by house. But on the cliff face of Graves Folly, there was calm. Ilara's world remained an island of profound peace amid the chaos. The massive rock wall took the full, unholy force of the blizzard and did not yield. The wind screamed over the top of the ridge, leaving the alcove in an eerie, protected silence. The deep overhang prevented any snow from piling against her log wall or her door. Inside, the fire in her hearth burned with a steady, serene orange glow, its smoke drawn cleanly up the Fisher chimney, untroubled by the gale. The great stone wall, her thermal battery, radiated a deep, constant warmth that pushed back the sub-zero temperatures. Her animals were calm, dozing in their pens. Her small garden was green and alive. She was not fighting the storm. She was simply outside its reach, living within the mountain's grace. She had everything she needed: warmth, water, food, and safety. The town that had pitied her was freezing in the dark. On the third night of the blizzard, when the wind was at its most violent, a new sound cut through the storm's roar. It was a frantic, desperate banging on her door. Silas erupted in a volley of fierce barks, standing guard before the heavy wood. Ilara's heart seized. No animal could make that sound. It was human. Cautiously, she lifted the heavy bar and pulled the door inward just a crack. A figure, caked in snow and ice, stumbled forward and collapsed onto her floor. It was a man, his face a mask of frostbite and raw desperation. As she pulled back his frozen hood, she saw it was Thomas Graves. He was barely coherent, his words choked with sobs and shivering. His son, little Daniel, was sick. A fever had taken hold in his lungs, and he was struggling for every breath. Their house was as cold as a tomb. The fire had gone out 2 days ago, the chimney blocked. He had spent a full day trying to tunnel to his woodpile, only to have the drift collapse on him. His wife, Mary, was huddled with the boy under every blanket they owned, but he knew they were losing. The child was fading. In a final, desperate act, Thomas had set out into the storm, not even sure where he was going, just moving toward a faint, flickering light he thought he had imagined on the ridge. He had followed the ghost of a light to her door. Ilara stood over the man who had taken everything from her, the man who had led the chorus of mockery against her. The memory of his cold words on her porch, of the town's cruel laughter at the name Cliffside Coop, was a bitter taste in her mouth. Her own resources were carefully rationed. Her firewood was meant to last until spring. Her food was the margin between survival and starvation. To help him, to take in his family, was to risk it all. It was to share her carefully won security with the very person who had cast her into the wilderness. For a single, frozen moment, The choice hung in the warm, still air of her home. But looking down at the broken man, a father terrified for his child, the choice was not a choice at all. It was an inevitability. Her survival meant nothing if it was built on a foundation of vengeance. She had not endured the back-breaking labor, the isolation, and the fear just to watch a child die. Without a word, she helped Thomas to a stool by the fire and ladled a hot broth of turnip and preserved meat into a bowl, forcing it into his trembling hands. "Drink," she commanded. Then she turned to her woodpile. She loaded a small, sturdy sled she had built for hauling logs, piling it high with precious dry pine and aspen. She wrapped preserved food, a pouch of dried herbs, and a dozen of her priceless eggs in a thick cloth. "Go," she told him, pushing him toward the door. "Get back to them. My dog and I will follow. We will bring them here." The rescue had begun. She was risking her own life, venturing into the white hell of the storm for the man who had wronged her. The journey to Thomas's farmhouse was a waking nightmare. The wind was a physical beast trying to tear them from their feet. Ilara followed in Thomas's staggering footsteps, the dog Silas at her heels, a steady, low anchor in the chaos. When they reached the house, it was a scene of utter despair. The inside was dark, frigid, and filled with a profound silence. Mary was huddled on a bed, her own body wrapped around her son's small, still form, trying to give him her last bit of warmth. The boy's breathing was a shallow, rattling whisper. When they stepped through the door of Ilara's shelter, the transition was so abrupt, so total, that it stunned them into silence. The warmth hit their frozen faces like a physical blow. The air was calm and smelled of life. Their eyes, accustomed to the freezing dark, slowly adjusted to the warm firelight. They saw the neat, towering stack of firewood. They saw the calm, healthy animals in their clean pen. And then they saw the most unbelievable sight of all. The small patch of green, living plants growing in a bed of dark earth against the rock wall. Mary gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Thomas simply stared, his eyes wide with a disbelief so profound it bordered on fear. They could not reconcile this place, this warm, orderly, thriving sanctuary, with the madwoman's Cliffside Coop of their imagination. This was not a hole of desperation. It was the safest, most well-provisioned place in the entire valley. Ilara wasted no time. She took the boy from Mary's arms and laid him gently on a bed of furs near the fire. She crushed the dried herbs and steeped them in hot water, making him breathe the steam to ease his congested lungs. She fed them all, hot broth, scrambled eggs, and rough bread. As he sat by the fire, cradling his son, who was slowly beginning to stir with a flicker of life, Thomas looked across at Ilara. His face, illuminated by the flames, was stripped of all its pride and arrogance. It was the face of a man who had seen the foundation of his world crumble and had been saved by the one person he had dismissed as a fool. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a broken whisper. "We were wrong." He had to stop, choking on the words. I called this place a death trap. I told everyone you were mad." He looked around the warm, secure space, at the evidence of her impossible achievement. "My God, Ilara," he said, his voice cracking. "We were the fools." Ilara looked at him, at his wife, at their sick child, all of them now utterly dependent on her. There was no triumph in her gaze, no satisfaction. She felt a deep, weary sense of peace. The verdict she had sought was not his admission, but the simple fact of their survival within her walls. She did not say, "I told you so." She did not say anything at all. She simply went to a small chest, took out another one of her precious wool blankets, and draped it over Mary's shoulders. "There is food," she said quietly. "Eat. Rest. The storm will pass." Her quiet grace was a more powerful statement than any accusation could ever be. In her victory, She offered not vengeance, but mercy. When the blizzard finally broke after 5 days, the world was remade in white and silence. The survivors of Promise Creek emerged from their damaged homes into a landscape of terrifying beauty, and they saw an impossible sight. A thin tendril of smoke rising steadily from Graves' Folly, and then 4 figures and a dog walking down the slope. The story spread through the shattered town with the speed of a wildfire. Thomas Graves, the man who had cast out his brother's widow, had been saved by her, his family sheltered in the very place he had mocked. People began to make the difficult trek up to the cliff face, not to gawk or mock, but with a new, desperate curiosity. They came to see the Cliffside Coop for themselves. They stood before her log wall and peered inside, their faces filled with awe. They saw the thermal wall, the indoor cistern, the winter garden. They saw a system of survival so elegant and effective it defied everything they thought they knew about building and living in this harsh land. Mr. Gable was among the first. He arrived, hat in hand, his own mercantile in ruins. "Mistress Graves," he said, the name no longer familiar or condescending, but filled with a profound and sudden respect. "My stock is lost. We have people with nothing to eat. I will trade you anything I have left for some of your eggs." Ilara simply nodded and gave him 2 dozen. She asked for nothing in return. The blizzard of '83 became a turning point for Promise Creek. The rebuilding that followed was different. The lessons of Ilara's shelter were not forgotten. New homes were built with a stone side, a thick wall designed to absorb the sun's heat and block the north wind. People began digging root cellars that were more than just storage, but extensions of their homes, using the earth's stable temperature. The phrase, "building with the land, not just on it," entered the local lexicon. Ilara's home became a landmark, a legend. Travelers passing through would hear the story of the widow who built a fortress in a death trap, whose hens were laying at 30 below when the rest of the world was freezing. The name Cliffside Coop was retired, replaced by a simple, reverent name, the Shelter. Ilara never moved back to the valley. The cliff was her home. She lived out her days there, a figure of quiet strength and wisdom. She never gloated, never reminded anyone of their past folly. She didn't have to. The proof was in the stone, in the warmth of her fire, in the continued miracle of life she had cultivated on barren rock. Her legacy was not just in the changed architecture of the town, but in the moral lesson she had taught them. It was a lesson about resilience, about seeing value where others see none, and about the quiet, unassailable power of a woman who simply refused to be broken. Years later, an old woman now, she would sit outside her home on a calm summer evening, the descendant of the dog Silas resting at her feet. She would look down at the twinkling lights of Promise Creek, a town she had inadvertently saved, and feel a profound sense of peace. She had been given nothing but a rock, and from it she had built not just a shelter, but a life.